Hello, everyone. Good day, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this new webisode of our CBAM series. Today, we're going to look at CBAM. We'll explain what are the requirements. There have been some updates in terms of formula, in terms of scope, and we'll give you an overview of what's your compliance risk. We are waiting a bit more than 100 participants today, so we'll give it a bit of time before starting with and diving into the topic. We are expecting people from Europe, but also from Asia, Vietnam, India. And so thank you very much for your time and your presence. We will distribute the presentation after the meeting as usual, and feel free to reach out to us in case you have any question or any comment. We have a technical team on the chat that will do their best to answer the questions that you may have. Again, it's a real pleasure to welcome you for this new episode of our CBAM series, together with Climis and together with Navis. As well as Normek very Fabien. So I'll present you today who will be the speakers during this webinar. So I'll start with myself, not very polite, I apologize, but I'm Nicolas Duchesne, I'm President and CEO of Normek very Fabien. And I'll be talking through the introduction of why CBAM has been implemented and what are the objectives. Then my colleague Leonard Barclay, who is a verifier and CBAM expert, will go into more details into the requirements. Mona Dimitrova from Climis, who provides an IT system to facilitate CBAM compliance, will then provide you further information on the formula that has been updated and the costs associated with compliance. And we have Davide Palumbo, who is CEO at Navis Trade and Consulting, who will also provide his insights as a consultant on how to report and how to comply in the easiest possible way. Thank you again for your time. Don't hesitate to use the chat for questions. And we'll now start and dive into the topic. So in terms of agenda, we'll cover supplier data and the tools which may be used for collecting emissions data. We'll take you some of the expected changes in terms of products and sectors and what are the obligations. We'll explain you the cost formula so that you can budget and anticipate compliance cost as well as timeline. We'll give you various tips and identify the risks that are faced by various sectors. And we'll finalize by giving you an insight on the uprising trends of ETS worldwide. So ETS stands for Emission Trading System. And as a consequence of CBAM, maybe along with some pressure from public and politicians, we have seen the creation of emission trading systems, meaning suppliers in third countries will have to report emissions, not only for CBAM, but also for their own country reporting and compensation purposes. We'll take you through the omnibus proposal quickly to show you the updates that the EU has in mind in terms of simplification before wrapping up and having a quick Q&A session. We feel it has been very helpful and meaningful to provide these webisodes on CBAM with partners so that all the angles of compliance are together, and so you can ask questions on any compliance aspects. Navis as consultants can help you and provide their expertise in terms of streamlining your reporting and making you understand what are your obligations and helping you achieve them in terms of buying the allowances or quota that will be required. Climis provide an IT system that facilitates the reporting and the sharing of the data, making it very easy to audit afterwards. So easy to share as well, because CBAM is a lot about collecting emissions data, breaking it down by product, and finally providing it to whoever requested, be it final client or the verifier. And speaking of verification, of course, Nordic Verifier is pursuing the accreditation for CBAM, which will be needed to audit the quarterly declarations of EU importers, but also the yearly reports from production facility outside of Europe. So CBAM, in a few words, what is it about? So basically, it's about putting a price on carbon on the products which are carbon intensive and which are imported from outside of Europe. In Europe, the highly intensive industries, they are already covered by the EU emission trading system, being a cement factory, a glass factory, petrochemistry, also aluminium, steel. Any big emitter is already paying the price of carbon. And so EU wants that the price of carbon is also applied to products or goods which are imported from outside Europe. And if there is already a carbon price in the third country, then the carbon price at the border will be adjusted as per the CBAM rules, which is something that will take a few years to put in place. But the idea is that if you already pay carbon price in your own country, if it's a third-party country, then your clients in Europe will not have to pay it again. The CBAM is a key pillar for the strategy EU Fit for 55, which is aiming at cutting carbon emission by 55% compared to levels of 1990, and this has to be achieved by 2030, so it's basically tomorrow. The objective is also to reduce carbon leakage and ensure that all industrial import face the same carbon pressure as EU-based equivalents. And the objective underlying is to encourage non-EU countries to implement their own CBAM or ETS so that CO2 prices can be aligned. There is an underlying objective of fostering collaboration between governments, suppliers, and importers. And we have seen examples. Leonard will talk a bit more through it, but in Vietnam, for example, or in Turkey, there have been initiatives in the last years aiming at creating a local ETS, which was one of the objectives of the CBAM. So it's working, and the underlying message to all of you who are producing goods is that monitoring of emissions is something that will become more and more important. It will have more and more financial value associated to it, and it's not going to go away. So the sooner you start looking into it, understand what are your requirements, the more optimal can be your compliance in terms of cost, in terms of energy, and in terms of time. So you can take you can be ahead of the pack in terms of your competitors who maybe are not in this webinar. As I was saying, the CBAM is about high-emitting sectors, and there are 6 sectors which have been the key focus of CBAM: the sector of steel and iron, sector of aluminium, cement, and fertilizers as well. And some energy sectors have also are also included in the CBAM scope, in particular electricity as well as hydrogen. The most highly intensive sectors in terms of greenhouse gases and in terms of carbon. That have been the key focus of CBAM at the beginning, although the scope is likely going to be expanded in the coming years. We'll talk a bit more about that. I would like now to hand over to my colleague Leonard Barclay, who will go into more details in terms of compliance and will explain what CBAM is about for you, whether you are EU importer or third party. I remind you that you can also ask questions on the chat, so don't hesitate. We'll pick up the relevant question at the end of the session. Thank you very much for your attention, and now over to you.
Thank you, Nicolas. So as you can see here, there are different times when you report if you're an importer or an exporter. It's quarterly if you're an importer and yearly if you're an exporter. Currently, we are now ending the transitional phase, which will end at the end of this year. So currently in the transitional phase, there are no real financial costs, only maybe the administrative operational costs to report on these quarterly emissions. There are also the fines if you don't report properly, but again, because there's no verification and this transitional phase is more for both the EU and stakeholders being importers and exporters to really get a sense of how to report, what is the most efficient way to report, etc., etc. But in only now about 6 months, we will enter the definitive phase, which will incur higher costs, both because you will require an accredited verifier. Importers, you will require a verifier to check your reports. The fines are also going to be much larger now, about 100 euros per undeclared ton, which is, I think, roughly the price of CBAM certificates / ETS certificates. So this is in order to essentially not so that you don't pay a fine instead of reporting properly. Additionally, finally, most importantly, you will need to purchase CBAM certificates and retire them for the following year. This will probably be the highest cost you will incur for CBAM. And finally, in 2027, even though we've already entered the definitive phase, you will need to declare your first definitive phase report in 2026. This will include the quantities you've imported along with the embedded emissions, which will be declared from your exporter. This will be you will have to make this report and submit it on the CBAM portal by the 30th of September. Originally, I think this was either in May or August, but it got delayed to September because to make it simpler for importers. And finally, you will have to show that you have surrendered the correct number of certificates. This will be a big step for you, so be prepared. I'll now hand the floor over to Mona. So Mona, you can take control now.
Thank you, Leonard. Yes, I will be speaking on behalf of Climies now. And yes, just as a follow-up on what you just said, so even if this transitional phase before 2026 can be seen as a learning period, the non-compliance fines will be up from between 10 to 50 euros per ton of CO2, which when translated into price increase per ton of product can be quite significant. For example, here we can see that for steel, this would represent a price increase of up to 56% per ton of product. And when it comes to fertilizers, aluminum, and cement, this can go up to around 100% price increase per ton of product. And when we get to the definitive CBAM period after 2026, when the fines will be as high as 100 euros per ton of CO2, things will look even different, obviously. So for steel, this would represent a price increase per ton of product of around 111%. And for aluminum, cement, and fertilizers, the price increase will be of around 200% per ton of product. But even despite those non-compliance penalties, it's very important to start planning about this financial CBAM cost exposure as early as possible because it will be quite significant. Here, just as a means of example, we have for steel products, if one imports 100 tons, for example, in 2026 they would need to pay around 7.5k euros, and this figure will go up to around 44.4k euros in 2034. So, okay, it's very important to start planning as early as possible for this cause, but in order to do so, one needs to understand how the CBAM formula works. So to simplify, we can think about this formula having two parts. So the CBAM emissions related to the product and a benchmark part. If we focus on this benchmark part first, it's the CBAM benchmarks multiplied by 1 minus a phase-in factor. This phase-in factor will be increasing over time. So logically, the whole benchmark part will be decreasing over time. And then one step further, the whole CBAM emissions minus this benchmark part will be gradually increasing over time and hence increasing once CBAM financial cost exposure up to 2034. But if we dig further, so it's really a myth that the phasing in will be as nice and gradual and slow as some of the EU communication has previously suggested. It's only a myth that only 2.5% of a product's emissions will fall under the CBAM tax in 2026. Actually, once we have understood the formula that I just presented, we can see that the proportion of the emissions that will fall under the CBAM tax are significantly higher. And in our crude steel case study that I am showing here, we can see that this can go up to 40%. Digging in a little bit more into this case study. So first of all, it's important to mention that the official benchmark values are not yet published, but this has been performed with projected benchmarks that are EU ETS aligned. And so if we remained in the crude sectors, in the crude steel sector, we can see that if we take assumptions of around 3 tons of CO2 per ton of product with a benchmark value of around 2, this would represent a price increase of around 20% as early as 2026. And going further into this, if we take an assumption of around 700 euro price per ton of product with an import volume of around 10K tons, this would represent an absolute value of CBAM financial cost of around 1.3 euros, only starting in 2026. And we have performed similar case studies for different commodities and different sectors. And over here, you can see the values of price increases that are very significant starting as early as 2026. And you can also see the absolute 2026 CBAM cost that the companies need to start planning for. Once again, underscoring how important it is to start taking into account this financial cost as early as possible. So now I'll be handing in to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. So as Mona was saying, you want to plan as soon as possible. So this includes, again, checking the EU website. It has all the documents and all the information you really require for to properly report for CBAM. It has the examples from, I guess you could say, fake companies that show how they report, the templates, who are the national competent authorities, which is very important because you need to work through a national competent authority to be a CBAM declarant, etc., etc. So if you have not started this yet, you need to do this right now. Just a quick overview, this is what the CBAM template that you have to, that your exporters, so importers, your exporters are where you share this template with them and they should fill it out. So I think this is only still working until the end of the transitional phase. It's not entirely clear yet, but if the next report is due at the end of this month. So if you have not shared this with your exporters yet, you should do it basically right now during this, even I would say even during this webinar. It's just another example of what it looks like. They enter the amount of CO2 per ton of product, what kind of product, etc., etc. I will now hand over to Davide, who will speak more about circumvention.
Hi, I hope you can all hear me, and it's so nice to see a very large audience this time. Circumvention. Unfortunately, I'm not a native speaker, so I can never be able to pronounce it in a proper way, so please excuse me. That's why it's important to understand the meaning. And according to the dictionary, it says the process of avoiding something, especially cleverly or illegally. Illegally is in red. Now, you can also see that there is a picture of a screw on this slide, and it will be clearer later on why I put this image here. Can you move to the next slide, please, Leo? Okay, first of all, the European Commission has recently published a questionnaire on CBAM, which is accessible to everybody. It's part of the Have Your Say initiative of the European Commission, which basically gives way to everybody who has an interest in any aspect of the European legislation to actually have a say in it and comment. And the most important part, and you can read in the explanation, this initiative extends the CBAM to some downstream products. Now, this is something that we've already touched base in the past, and clearly, if you are importing screws, I go back to the image on the first slide, and you are subject to CBAM, at the same time, if the same screw is used inside the product, now the European Commission is starting to think, well, why should that be exempt from CBAM? I saw one raise the hand. I don't know if it was by mistake or not. And so it's very important to focus on the fact that the CBAM regulation is evolving, and it might be encompassing more products in the future. The same categories, steel, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, cement, and so forth, hydrogen, but whether these products are also the substances, products, or items in scope of the regulation are also inside some equipment, well, now this is under the scrutiny of the European Union. And I sincerely invite you all to use the link that I put here and read the questionnaire, actively participate, put your input there because it's important. This is a very important moment for you to participate in a way to the lawmaking and the publication and development of the regulation itself. So it's an important moment, and I really wish you all could have a say in it. And there is also the concern about the rules on default values and the criteria for using, for example, electricity emission and so forth. So as you can see, the scope is quite large of this questionnaire because it touches all the substances of CBAM, and it's clearly showing an attention to the circumvention, which will be clearer once we go to the next slide. Please, Leo. Now, in the description of the questionnaire, there is carbon border adjustment mechanism, downstream extension, so downstream products, anti-circumvention, because there is the possibility to circumvent the CBAM regulation. How can this happen? Well, in principle, there are two ways to circumvent the CBAM regulation, and they are all linked to the tariff codes. As you know, every single product that enters the European Union must be classified according to its nature. So if it's a product which is made of steel, iron, and has a specific function, should be classified accordingly. And because of its classification, it triggers the compliance with the regulation. And the fact that now the European Commission has somehow understood that there is some work to be done in terms of customs activities clearly shines through the questionnaire. And in our working experience, we have seen companies that involuntarily were circumventing the law. This is quite common, especially in big organizations. Now, I am importing something. I don't have the expertise in terms of customs classification, so I rely on a third party, which is the customs broker, customs agent, to do the work for me. The custom brokers, the custom agent will ask a very basic question: what is it that you are importing? And if the answer is, well, it's a part of, they will take it that as a good answer and they will act upon it. So It might be the cases, and we see it day in and day out, that companies are quite relaxed. They say, well, it's okay, we don't have anything to do with CBAM. But this might actually be based on the wrong assumption, the assumption that you are actually using all the correct tariff codes. And I'm linking back to the comment from Nicola at the very beginning. It's important to do an assessment. It's important to do a health check of where you are with the compliance with the regulation. So, and under this point of view, we really need to be very careful and have some internal conversation. We can go ahead to the next slide. And you can skip to the next because this is a repeated slide, apparently. There are some draft penalties. It was already explained a little bit better by the colleagues from Claimies. So it's important to start looking into this specific topic and be aware that they will come starting from 2026. So you are still on time to review your current procedures. And if you think that you need any help, you can reach out. You have all our contacts. We will be more than happy to support you, and make sure that at least if you think that you are not in scope of CBAM, you have the actual certainty that you are not based on assumptions. You can move to the next slide.
Thank you, David.
I think you jumped one, but that's okay. Fine.
Thank you, Davide. So I'll be now talking about the verification requirements for next year. So as I said before, you will need starting next year to contact an accredited verifier to check your CBAM reports. That's a requirement from the EU. In this verification report, you will need to put in the product you've imported, that being in terms of CN codes. So as Davide said, you'll need to put the correct CN code, and these are all detailed in Annex 1 and part of Annex 2, I think, of the EU regulation. And additionally, the CBAM declaration will include these attributes. So, and these attributes essentially can be summarized. So you can see import proof, import customs, verified CO2 data, blah, 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 can be summarized in the international supplier report, which will include the embedded emissions per ton of steel, the verification statement of the exporter. This can be there is still I still see debate right now in the EU regarding who can verify the exporting facility, but there will be, I'm sure, some kind of official verification statement, independent verification statement asserting that the embedded emissions per ton declared by the exporter is correct. Finally, very important also, the local carbon price paid in this country. So, for example, in China, where they have an ETS on power, the electricity sector, the power generating sector pays a local carbon price on the amount of carbon they emit, as to not pay double the price on carbon per ton. Importers can declare, well, because my exporter already paid a certain amount of a carbon tax, carbon allowances, I shouldn't have to pay double. Not only does this make it kind of more fair to not overcharge importers, but also this encourages countries and companies who are exporting their CBAM goods to really push forward with this, because this will make them more competitive on the international market, because their goods will then become cheaper. So for verification to be done properly according to ISO 17029 and ISO 14064, these are the steps necessary to complete this. I'm basically sharing this because when clients come to us for our services, they often think it's basically maybe contractual, commercial ops, data analysis, and confirmation on CBAM portal. No, there is many steps included in verification, which we have to do. We are required to pursue these steps, which will take a lot longer than you think it will, not only because there's more steps than you think, but also CBAM is still not only in the transitional phase, but it is still, even when it's in its definitive phase, it is still very new for us and for you and for the exporters. So it will take, I'm sure, at least 1 or 2 years for it to become a regular recurring thing. Verifiers know what to check, you know what to declare, etc., etc. So keep in mind, look for your verifiers now or very, very soon, because next year you will need an accredited verifier. So keep that in mind. So for your verification, of course, make sure your data is accurate, try to automate the processes as much as possible to avoid human error, keep it organized. Of course, don't wait until the last minute. Your next report is due in 2 weeks, so that's very, very soon. It doesn't need to be verified, but you do need to submit some report on the CBAM portal, so you should do this. If you haven't started, start it now. Of course, don't withhold any information, because as Davide mentioned, or even the EU will catch up to you if you try to put either the wrong CN code or if you try to not declare something. It will be found. And finally, also, if you don't just assume your imported goods are exempt, as Davide mentioned, really have a thorough analysis of what goods you are importing and if they could be relevant in CBAM. So partially because of the general overview consensus on climate change and sustainability, but also because of CBAM, some countries are implementing their own ETSs so as to make their goods more competitive on the global market. As I said, if a company already pays, let's say, for example, in this example, Turkey pays a local carbon price of 10 euros equivalent per ton of CO2, the importer can reduce their CBAM compliance cost by 10 euros per ton of imports. So some of the countries that are notably implementing their ETSs are Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and Japan, Turkey, Brazil, and Chile. I'll share a more detailed map later on. Additionally, the UK not only is developing a CBAM, their own CBAM in 2027, but there was also very recently, I think 2-3 months ago, talks between the EU and the UK of linking their own ETSs. So this may lead to then not being a UK ETS or having just EU allowances work in the UK, potentially CBAM goods not having to be declared if they're from the UK and vice versa. So there's nothing definitive here yet, but there are talks. So for those listening to us from the UK or who export to the UK, please keep this in mind that there are developments about this. Now, here's a very detailed map of the current global state for ETS. Apologies for the low quality. It's the most up-to-date best picture I could find. So the blue here basically means there is already an ETS in place. So for those exporting from China and Indonesia or Australia, for example, keep in mind that your importers will be very interested in knowing how much you're paying to produce your good, how much you're paying in terms of carbon pricing for your goods, because this will lead to a reduction in their cost. I'd also like to point out that we see a lot of the green here means that there is an ETS in development. So you can see there's a large development here in Southeast Asia and also in South America. I think Brazil just released either their draft statement, so you should look into this. And India and Vietnam have also released some initial statements on their ETSs, how it will work, which companies will be in the scope of it. I know at least for Vietnam, a lot of the companies that will be in scope are the highest emitting ones, which are also in the EU ETS and CBAM. So for those from Vietnam, keep in mind that you will have to probably declare for an ETS starting maybe next year, and with that, this will greatly help your EU clients to make their CBAM declarations. So, and I would greatly encourage you to click on the link or to just go on the International Carbon Action Partnership webpage. It's a very, very good webpage detailing all the ETSs of every country. Next, the reason why I'm emphasizing on how I'm hearing the link is not working. We'll send you the link after the end of the webinar. So the reason I emphasize on this international partnership with different ETSs is because, for example, an exporter in Vietnam, let's say an exporter of steel, their direct emissions, so scope 1 emissions, will be due to their direct iron to steel transformations, blast furnaces, etc. Their scope 2 will be the electricity and heat they use to have their machines work. And finally, their scope 3 will be the emissions caused downstream from the retailer, for example, in the EU. Now, assuming that the Vietnam ETS will work like any other ETS, I'm assuming that their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions will be in scope of their ETS. And this scope 1 and scope 2 emission is actually the scope 3 emission of the EU retailer. So the EU retailer will be very curious to know their upstream emissions, their scope 3 upstream emissions, which will in turn be the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions of their Vietnam exporter. So really, you can all cooperate on this and keep in to make this as simple and cheap as possible for all involved in the supply chain. So it would be good to get familiar with scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions just to understand what's probably in scope for your ETS or CBAM. Next, we have the Omnibus package. I'm sure most of you have heard of it by now, the big simplification package for CSRD, CSDDD, and also CBAM. This is basically to reduce the administrative burdens and also maybe financial burdens on smaller companies who generate much less carbon, but because of smaller budgets don't have the same sustainability quality teams to properly report on their emissions. So the main updates are the most important is the minimum threshold, which was originally 150 euros per consignment to 50 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year, which from what I've heard, eliminates 90% of companies, all while keeping in 99% of emissions. This is the numbers that I see in every either news article or industry white paper. Finally, as previously mentioned, the certificate surrender is until, well, here it says August 31st, but I read recently it was September 30th. Again, the omnibus, I want to specify, is not definitive, so there could be updates in the coming months for CBAM and the other policies. So currently, I think you have to surrender your certificates by September of the following year. So, for example, the first time you will need to surrender your certificates will either be August 2027 or September 2027. Additionally, to make the whole CBAM certificate market a bit more liquid and a bit more simple, you won't need to hold the correct number. You only need to hold 50% of the correct number of certificates, I think, every quarter, instead of 80%, which was the original number. The certificate purchase is delayed. Additionally, also very important, you can now delegate the authorization process, so which will make it easier. You can contact an expert to essentially be your CBAM declarant to help you with the EU portal instead of maybe going through a consultant who will get back to you and then you still having to do most of the work. Additionally, as also Davide mentioned briefly, there will be possible inclusion of downstream goods. This is because some of the goods, even though they're made of steel and are very, very similar to some goods that are under the CBAM scope in Annex 1, somehow they are not within scope. So the EU is still thinking of reducing this, of basically mitigating this issue by including these goods. Finally, you may use default emissions still, I think, until maybe next year. This is, even though these default emission factors will be penalizing for you as they are higher than what is the real emission amount, it will still make it a lot easier for people to report at least something in their reports. Keep in mind these numbers are conservative, so if you do use them, you will end up paying more for your CBAM certificates. Additionally, as mentioned for China and Vietnam, as they all have ETSs, your CBAM costs will decrease if you purchase from these countries. The EU is still finalizing, I think, on how much reduction you would have per ton of good imported. So keep an eye out for that. It should probably come out in the next few months, I assume. Oh yeah, and finally, yes, the default values, but keep in mind they're penalizing. So next, the downstream products. Keep in mind that yes, just because you don't think your CN code is within Annex 1, it might very well be. So keep in mind that the list of downstream products will be released probably very soon. So keep in mind, so for example, a washing machine is not directly on the Annex 1, but because it's made of CN codes of steel and iron, etc., etc., that good currently is not covered under CBAM. But the EU, in order to not have huge imports of washing machines that are now essentially still emitting the same amount of carbon as any washing machine, is still thinking of having goods like that covered under CBAM. Again, also, if a product really looks like a product that is under scope, it's very likely that the EU will end up adding this to the list of products in Annex 1. So I think, for example, I heard steel pipes that are cut and threaded are treated as steel products under CBAM, but if it's put into a car engine, it becomes a different good. So I believe that, for example, for these kinds of things where there's a very, very small transformation of the product, it would still be under the CBAM scope. Additionally, keep in mind that it's important the EU to be able to quantify and monitor these emissions. So if this good still has a good LCA data from let's say proper databases, it's very likely that these products will be added to the CBAM scope. Finally, also, yes, if these goods are in scope for the EU ETS, I believe there will almost definitely be added to CBAM. I don't know exactly which goods are not in CBAM but are in ETS, but if it's not in ETS, if it's not in CBAM now but in ETS, it's very, very likely that it will be added probably by next year. So this has all to do with the carbon leakage risk that the EU wishes to avoid, basically, with CBAM. So these are the types of products that are not in CBAM scope, but most likely will be. You can see for example, iron and steel, we have tube pipes, as I mentioned, mechanical parts, etc., etc. You will receive these slides, so you can after the webinar, so you'll be able to see these later on. Here's more examples: organic chemicals, ceramics. So essentially, yeah, to kind of finish off, make sure that you have the correct CN codes listed. Even if you don't think you're in CBAM scope, you might very well be. So speak to Davide or someone from Navis to make sure that to better understand what goods you are importing and if they are under scope. Start speaking to your suppliers now if you haven't yet, because especially if you have a language barrier, it may take a lot of time to get information from them, and maybe they also have to speak to their own suppliers, who maybe even they have their own suppliers. So you should really have a good overview of who your suppliers are and who their suppliers are. I think Climies can help you with that as well. Additionally, estimate how much this whole CBAM policy will cost you to better plan for your financial year. Try essentially to reduce your CBAM costs as much as possible by either having pushed for PPAs or by purchasing from countries with ETSs in place, because if there is an ETS, you will not have to pay twice for that carbon that was emitted. Additionally, as I mentioned, because now with lots of ETSs and also ESG frameworks coming into place, like India and the UAE, these ESG reports will include emissions. So you can use both all your ETS, your CBAM, and your ESG reports. A lot of the information will be repeated. So we really encourage you to not maybe give different departments the different jobs, because essentially they will be doing the same thing, and there's no point in repeating the same tasks. So I think now we'll move on to the Q&A. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Leonard. Thank you, Davide. Thank you, Mona, as well. I think Mona had to leave us for some other important meeting, but we'll be in touch with them in case there are some questions associated to their responsibility areas. I hope you found this webinar insightful so far, and I would like to take a couple of questions from the Q&A. And so don't hesitate to put some more questions, and we'll take as many as we can. So there was a question on the reporting of 2026 and the emissions from 2025. They have to be verified. There was some confusion there. I would like to apologize for it, but the emissions from the year 2025 will not have to be verified. We would strongly recommend you to go through pre-verification and compliance gap analysis process in order to avoid last-minute surprises and make sure that you processes are compliant before the official reporting phase starts. But the year 2026 is the year for which your activity will have to be verified before it is reported to the authorities. And the financial impact, so the purchase of certificates and surrendering of certificates, I think has been extended to February 2027 as per the omnibus proposal. There was another question about the threshold and whether they apply to individual products or whether they apply to complex goods as well. So I will give a first part of the answer, and maybe I can let you, Davide, elaborate afterwards on the complex goods. So the omnibus proposal raised the threshold for de minimis, so the threshold from which you are exempted of reporting from 150 euro initially to 50 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So this threshold of 150 euro meant that as soon as you have shipment of greater value than 150 euros, then you would be under the scope of CBAM. So it was very low, and it would have included in the scope of CBAM a lot of small actors, which would have created a lot of administrative complexity or relatively low impact, which is the reason why the EU proposed to increase that threshold to 50 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, which I understand is for the total of your imports. And if you exceed that threshold of 50 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, then you have to report and get your emissions verified and also purchase the CBAM quotas. The impact of the increase of the threshold is expected to be fairly limited in the sense that a huge number of potential companies in the scope have been excluded, but they represented less than 1% of the emissions under the scope of CBAM. So the expectations is that the system remains as ambitious as it was, and that it's really simplified from an administrative perspective by putting out of scope a lot of small actors. In terms of complex goods, and so whether CBAM applies to individual world product or also complex goods, maybe I can let you, Davide, elaborate a little bit on this aspect.
Yes, just to touch base also about the threshold. The 150 euro threshold was on the intrinsic value of the consignment. And this was actually generating some confusion because it's basically, I don't know which one of you is familiar with Incoterms, but it's the FOB value. So the value of the products excluding transportation cost and insurance. And that's why, because there was so much confusion, the European Union decided to go for the tons of CO2 equivalent, which is a much more tangible, now measurable unit from the customs perspective. About the inclusion of finished goods, as you can see, this is a work in progress, and it's part of the attention brought up by the many stakeholders. That, for example, they were saying, okay, I am importing steel which is used for the manufacturing of a specific piece of equipment, and if that specific piece of equipment is imported from outside the European Union, it's not in scope of CBAM. That's kind of unfair, and the voice of the customer was listened to by the European Commission, and that's why there is also now the attention to downstream products, because as you can see, the tariff codes which are mentioned on the Annex 1 and Annex 2 of the regulation are very specific. So you can find work of aluminium, you can find screws, bolts, washers, whatnot. But if you have a special piece of equipment which is entirely made of steel, which has no specific function, but it is used as an accessory or as a part of a product, it flies way below the radar and is not in scope of CBAM. And that's why the European Union is using this hard word, which is circumvention. So it's important, as I mentioned earlier on, to constantly be updated. And Leo shared the information about the European website, where you can see a lot of information there, the latest regulatory publications and so forth. And of course, you can be in touch with us. If you have any other question, please, you know where to find us. I hope I've answered the question, Nicola.
Yeah, thank you, Davide. There was another question from Nora Juaz on in the definitive period, both direct and indirect emissions need to be reported, and the formula of calculation of cost takes into account only direct emission. So for CBAM, what must be reported is the embedded emissions within a good, which consist of the direct emissions and some of the indirect emission. So the use of various type of fuel during the process is definitely direct emission and will have to be included in the embedded emission. But this is also the case of the portion of emission from the electricity used to produce these goods. This must be reported in the CBAM emissions. In terms of the formula that has been presented by our colleague from Climate, we'll check with them, but as I mentioned, emissions, which I think correspond to embedded emissions, so it includes both the direct portion and also the electricity production. There was also a question from Fabian Young. So as a major fertilizer importer, to comply with CBAM calculation, we need to know the CBAM benchmarks. As far as we understand, those benchmarks do not exist. And do you have any additional information on that? Unfortunately, no, we don't have more information as indicated by Saul Robbins. The EU indicated that this will be published in the third quarter of 2025. And before these benchmarks are published, indeed, it's difficult to estimate reliably what would be the impact of CBAM for your activity. So we'll keep an eye on this publication by the EU. There was a question from Vladislav Zaikin. Do you know when the rules for accrediting CBAM verifier and verification process will be finalized? So again, we don't have insider information on that. We expect further information to be published in the third or fourth quarter of the year. We're in touch with various national accreditation bodies in Europe, and they are all under a lot of pressure, and they are under pressure on different programs, not only CBAM. So from our understanding, the order of priority for national accreditation bodies will be, and so for authorities, will be or is ETS2 first, then CSRD, and then will come CBAM. So some national legislation has to be also implemented so that the national accreditation body can take the application for CBAM. And from our understanding, this is also something that is in process, but will take a few months. However, from our side, we have already applied with COFRAC, so in France, to submit our application. The standard that will be used is ISO 17029, which is about independent verification in general. And we already have this accreditation at Normek Verifavia, which means we'll have to extend it for the CBAM specificity. But the process is not starting from zero, so it should be pretty quick to pursue once the official requirements are fully clarified. Is it so? Question from Anne de Badier on cost formula. Is it planned to have a cost formula for each CN code? I don't think so. I think the cost formula will be about the total emissions and also the benchmark. So per sector, but not really per CN code. Is verification for same question from Ms. de Badier. Verification is possible from the country of the supplier directly. We import from China, or verifiers are only based in EU countries. So for CBAM, verifiers, they must be accredited by EU national accreditation body, which doesn't mean they have to be based in EU, but they must apply to one of the EU authorities. There are two aspects. One is the verification of the report of the declarant, so which is combining various imports. And then there is the other aspect, which is the one you're referring to for the third party based in China, who are China or Vietnam or Taiwan or wherever. And these emissions, they must also be verified by a verifier who has CBAM accreditation. The way we are addressing this at Normek Verifavia is to organize partnerships with local verifiers to capitalize on what is already done by these local verifiers instead of starting from scratch CBAM only verification. We have been in touch with partners in Korea, also in Vietnam, and we think this approach will be quite efficient. Do you want to provide some more information, Leonard?
Yeah, just to say, so facility audits, so the exporting facility, let's say in China, will require some form of site visit. There is details on the EU legislation saying site visit will be required unless you can waive it in some very specific way. However, there's no detail on what the verifier, if the verifier needs to be, for example, the same, or I guess not the same as the one verifying the report, if they need to be from that country for language barrier reasons, etc. I have not found any detail on what the nature of how the nature of the verifier needs to be, only that a facility audit will be required. So that's the details I have. Then I found that directly on the legislation.
Thank you, Leonard. There was a question on the purchase of certificates, let's say, for CBAM or credits.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we take the parallel with the ETS, you will not know the exact quantity of quotas that you need before they have been fully verified. But it doesn't prevent you from acting early and anticipating and benefiting from what you think is a good price for at a given time for these credits. So there will be traders, and Navis can help you with that. depending on the level of complexity and the optimization that you want with your cost of CBAM certificate, there can be various possibilities. It's a trading mechanism with same market rules as other markets. And there would be probably various types of products also available. So if you want to limit the cost of carbon for CBAM compliance, it's something that is possible. And you can do it based on estimations of what would be your requirements. Although the exact value that you need to report will only be known after the verification.
I just want to specify for the CBAM allowances, they will be based on the weekly, I think, auction allowances of UETS credits.
Yeah.
So there will be a direct link.
Yes, and there is also a very important piece of information. To the best of my knowledge, the shelf life of the allowances is 2 years. So
Yes.
you really need to be very careful when you plan your activities. So a good indication is your past reporting. So if you analyze the result of each quarterly report that you have filed so far, you have more or less a pretty good idea of your yearly requirement. Then you factor in your business growth and so forth, and you can somehow have a rough idea of the carbon credits that you would need on a yearly basis. And starting to look into the market